Hi, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Radwan Ziada. I'm the senior fellow at the uh, Arab Center, Washington, D.C. It's interesting time for anyone following the event in Syria. It's the Nobody expected us or through the weekends, an armed Syrian armed opposition be able to capture. Now that today they capture Hama, most likely they're going into Homs, and this is basically will be half of Syria now, or Syria divided between half in the hand of the Assad government and half in the hand of the opposition. And that's exactly the perfect timing to discuss the question of justice and accountability. But today also, I'm not sure if a kind of celebration or if a kind of rethinking of 10 years ago. In January 2014, a group of experts released a shocking report detailing the mass killing and torture inside the Syrian detention centers. The report was based on thousands of photos, 55,000 of photos of dead detainees taken by the Syrian defector, codenamed Caesar, who had worked as a forensic photographer for the Syrian Military Intelligence. While the report and the shocking images were clear evidence of systematic mass killing and mass murder inside the Syrian prisons, the UN Security Council failed to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court 10 years after the report, still the same. Additional information documenting the Syrian torture and the killing of detainees continue to surface. Yet the international community is unable to hold the Assad regime accountable for its human rights abuses. Now, the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., is glad to host a webinar to speak with the key expert who's been working on the issue of justice and accountability and working, and maybe as a Professor David Green himself, drafting the Caesar report himself. I'm very glad to join here by Professor David Crane, who is the founding chief prosecutor for the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone and distinguished scholar in residence for Syracuse University College of Law. And just to add here, he's been working on the case of Syria since the beginning. Uh, and then we have Yasmin Nahlawi, who's the head of the investigation team at the Syrian British Council. And then we have Reem Salahi, who's been working on Syria in different positions. Now she's working with the US State Department and former senior advisor to the International Commission of the Missing Person, ICMP. Thank you for everyone joining now. And let's start with Professor David. Um, I think if you tell us more about the history of the Caesar report and why it's matter now, 10 years since then. Just the mute.
Thank you, Radwan, and salam alaikum, dear friends. It's a pleasure to address you this morning, this afternoon. We need justice for Syria. There's always been a need for justice for Syria, not just since Dara in 2011 during the Arab Spring, but going back all the way into the 1980s. The Assad regime has been a horror to the people of Syria, and they deserve justice. And that's how I approached this talk this morning, but I've been thinking and working on the Syria issue since 2011, where I met Radwan and his colleagues in The Hague, where we were considering justice mechanisms by which we could prosecute fairly and openly the Assad family for what they had done to the people of Syria. And we continue to do so with the Syrian Accountability Project, which has been in existence since March of 2011, part of the Global Accountability Network. You know, it was an interesting phone call that I received back just before New Year's Eve on 2013. The Qatari government had asked me and my former deputy prosecutor, Sir Desmond de Silva, whether we would be interested in coming to Doha and taking a look at some interesting items that had just suddenly surfaced, and they were quite concerned about the validity of what they had in front of them. And oh, by the way, we have the person who brought these things with him also in Doha. That was kind of the introduction. And so Sir Desmond and I flew to Doha. We had been kind of briefed as to essentially what there was. They had 54,000 high-definition photographs of destroyed human beings in Syria, and they wanted to know whether these were actually valid photographs. And also, the young Master Sergeant from the Syrian army who defected through the lines, traveled down through Jordan, down into Qatar, needed to be interviewed. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to see what they had in front of them. And so we put together a rather distinguished team. We also brought in Sir Geoffrey Nice. We also brought in some very important forensic scientific doctors who had a lot of experience in forensic pathology, forensic anthropology, and also, just as importantly, forensic photography. And so this team with Sir Desmond and I traveled to Doha, where we were warmly received. And in some ways, they seemed to be almost grateful that we came, because they had no idea what to do with what they had. And we weren't really sure either. We were quite skeptical, having been and having worked in this area for over 20 years at that time. We were skeptical as to what we had. So we had a three-part plan. The first was the scientists, the forensic people, would go and look at the photographs that morning and to just see what that was. And then Sir Desmond and I, along with Sir Geoffrey Nice, sat down with a young, very frightened Master Sergeant from the Syrian army who wasn't sure where all this was going. And, we were kind of a formidable looking group on the other side of the table. We tried to make him relax, but he was quite nervous for at least for a while. And then he realized that we weren't trying to do anything other than try to figure out what he had and how he got here. So our job was to just assess if this guy was really who he was and what he had done, and understand and just try to figure out whether this guy was the real deal, as we say in America. And so that's what we did. And then what we were going to do is, after dinner that evening, the scientists and the lawyers were going to sit around and make a decision whether this was for real. And then if it was, then phase two would be to go back again and really start focusing on the evidence, focusing on the young sergeant, and really getting into the details. And then phase three, if we continued forward, was to write the report and then give it to the Qatari government for their use, and move on from there. So the first phase, the scientists went off. We sat down with the sergeant. And oh, by the way, I am the guy who gave him the code name Caesar, because we just didn't want his name to be known. I mean, the Syrian government had thought he had died. It's very cleverly done. What they had done, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this, they had, quote, killed him as he tried to defect into the Free Syrian Army lines. And so they announced to the world that he had been killed, but in reality, they were moving him down into Doha, which was very clever. They eventually, and of course, his family thought he was dead. But they eventually they quietly talked to the family, told them what's going on. And then they also very carefully removed, that hadn't happened when we were talking to this young sergeant, but this, who was a forensic photographer, they also moved them down into to Doha. And so he was reunited with his family. So that's kind of a good news story. So we sat down with him and just said, tell us. And it's really quite a horror story at many levels. He was a master sergeant in the Syrian army. He was a forensic photographer, and his job was to take pictures of deceased individuals. Prior to the Civil War, most nations of the world take pictures of deceased people, make a record of their death, and then forward it to appropriate levels of government to file that away. And so that's what he was doing. And then as the Civil War started, he was taking pictures, but then the bodies start piling up in the parking lot of this military hospital. But he continued to do his work. But it wasn't long before he realized that he was actually starting to see friends and neighbors on the table in front of him, and it started to bother him. So he signaled to the opposition that I can take these photographs, but also keep a copy and forward them out, which he did for a couple of years. And then finally he signaled to them, I can't take this anymore. It's too horrific. These bodies are destroyed, and they really truly were, as you've seen the photographs. And of course, all the photographs are not publicly available. The ones that we saw were beyond description. And so so what he did is he took 54,000 high-definition photographs and four memory sticks, hid them in the heel of his shoe, and walked out of the hospital and never looked back. Fled into across the lines into the opposition army, Free Syrian Army, and then, of course, I've told you he was through Jordan, was moved down to Doha, where we came in. And so we're just letting him talk, which is a way you do it sometimes as a prosecutor, which we are both very experienced in, Sir Desmond and I, and also Sir Jeffrey Neese. And so, but then what we did is we met at dinner, after dinner, with our scientists, and we sat around and we gave our assessment. Our assessment was that we believed he was telling the truth and that we needed to explore this more. The scientists came back and they went, holy cow, these are real photographs. These are horrific photographs. We only looked at 500 of them today, but these are truly correct photographs of deceased human beings. And and they said that the remarkable thing about this is that all of the deceased individuals had numbers on their foreheads, which you can see. And that was also part of the administrative processing of dead human beings across. They linked the number, and as they were taking photographs, as Caesar now, as he's called, was taking photographs, he put that number, matched it, and then filled out the report as to what the obvious, to him, what the obvious death was, which, interestingly enough, was all of them had heart attacks, but they had not been. They had been starved, tortured, and killed. So he forwarded the photographs, the paperwork that he was required to fill out, forward to a forensic pathologist in Syria, and he did not know where they went. The interesting part is, as we were interviewing him, after in phase 2 as well as in phase 1, is he wasn't doing this for his own. He didn't talk about himself. He didn't talk about money. He didn't talk about anything other than he was very clinical in his professional assessment of what was going on. And so that played an important role in our assessment that he was really telling the truth. So the bottom line is the scientists said these are for real. We need to dive into this, but it looks like we have uncovered a horror story beyond description. And so we moved into phase 2. We spent a full week going over the photographs and interviewing Caesar in various ways, trying to trip him up, trying to catch him. We didn't do it in a negative way, but there are techniques which you can cause people to, quote, change their story, and then it starts to unravel. But he became more and more relaxed and became more and more specific in his discussions. And of course, I'm not giving you the whole week's worth of discussion, other than essentially his story expanded. But we were impressed with the fact that he was not doing this for himself. He told me he was doing this for the people of Syria. The world had to know, and that carried a great deal of weight with us. So we came back together. We meet after dinner every night, and just go around the table discussing all of this stuff. And it got worse and worse. At the end of the day, at the end of that phase 2, we assessed that we had 54,000 high-definition photographs, and our scientists said that it showed the starvation, torture, and murder of over 11,000 Syrian people in this particular detention facility alone. And as we all know, there are many detention facilities. So we really don't know the total story of the horror that the Assad regime has done to the people of Syria in these detention centers. This was just one. So again, in phased, then we all had to kind of go our various ways and stuff. And Sir Desmond and I sat down and drafted the Caesar report and briefed the Qatari government, the foreign minister, the minister of defense, and the secretary to the head, the prime minister. And that report was handed over to them formally. And in some ways, our job was done as far as what we had been asked to do. However, they realized that they had quite a smoking gun. And it is a smoking gun. And let me digress here. You know, when you're investigating atrocities, a lot of what you're getting is data and information that in some ways cannot be used in court as evidence. And so this is a misconception in this technological age where a lot of videos, a lot of photographs of people being destroyed circulate through the social media networks. That's not evidence. That's just data. We can't use that in court. You know, the rules of evidence and procedure require relevancy and foundation. And in most instances, we have to bring in the guy that took the photograph to tell him I took the photograph, and that is a valid picture of what I took, a representation of what I took. That's the standard. And so, you know, we had 54,000 photographs, but the most unique thing about it is we had paperwork as well. So this is the first time for Syria that we actually had direct, specific evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity against the Assad regime. In other words, I could take this and Caesar into court and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that President Assad, his family, his henchmen were destroying the people of Syria. And so this is what the critical part of this, and this is what really the whole world gasped at, is this is the first time we had direct evidence of the horror of what Assad was doing. We all knew what he was doing, and we all had evidence, and we had pictures and all kinds of, and the media was showing the horror of all this. But to actually have direct, specific evidence that could go into court, this was the first time. So I think this was significant. So I was flying back to the United States, and when I landed, my phone exploded, and it turned out I had over 38 news agencies waiting for me to want to speak about the Caesar report, which was revealed by Christian Amanpour in London with Sir Desmond and Dr. Stewart, who was the forensic pathologist, announcing to the world what Assad had done. And so for the next several days, I was on television telling the world the horror story of what Assad had done. Now, the story of Caesar hasn't ended. Of course, now what do we do with Caesar? And so we left it to the Qatari government. We told him he has to be protected. We knew his family was working their way down, but I didn't want to know where he was, and I still don't know where he is because it's important that he not be known where he is. I know he is out there. He is fine. His family is fine, but I don't know where he is. And but he did a great service for the people of Syria, took great courage to step forward and do this, because literally he blew the top off of what the Assad regime was doing. And of course, we've been working through the Syrian Accountability Project of the Global Accountability Network, and we have built a crime-based matrix of over 30,000 pages of verifiable evidence against war crimes and crimes against humanity. We have a conflict map, which is a narration of the horror that Assad had started in 2011. And we also have a major incident index, which allows a future local, regional, or international prosecutor to review 400 pages of the most significant crimes and can use that potentially as an indictment against Assad and his henchmen. So thank you for allowing me to describe the amazing story of this young master sergeant in the Syrian army who had the courage to come forward, who is now known to the world as Caesar. And so my hat is off to him. But I do want to underscore is that we're starting, we're moving forward, and we need to continue to work for justice for the people of Syria. Thank you, Radwan.
Thank you, David. I think this is the first time the Syrians, if they join us here, they will hear the story behind the story of Caesar and how he got the nickname, because I got thousands of questions why it's called Caesar. It is not known as a Syrian name. But unfortunately, we supposed to talk to take it because David talked about the phase 1 and phase 2 of the Caesar report, and there is a phase 3 and phase 4. And we were supposed to have Muaz Mustafa, who's the executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, to talk about that. This is why I briefly go through those 2 steps before go into Reem. What's happened that's the Qatari government, along with the French government, they took the report into the Security Council. And we have a closed meeting of the Security Council on August 2014. And we have a Security Council resolution to refer the case into the International Criminal Court. But then we have a public hearing on August 2014, where China and Russia both vetoed the resolution. And we still now, after 10 years, there is no refer to the case of the International Criminal Court because Syria is not signatory member of the Rome Statute, and this is why the ICC cannot open investigation of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the state of Syria. But what happened politically after that, the activists in the United States, especially the Syrian community in United Syrian American, they took the case into the Congress. And I think David also testified in front of the Congress on the case. And what happened as a Caesar report turned into a Caesar law. And it started in 2015 until it passed in 2019 during the first Trump administration, which put sanctions on the Assad regime, one of the strongest sanctions against the Syrian regime, and anyone will aid the Syrian regime torturing and killing the Syrian people. And that's the Caesar law supposed to be actually renewed at the end of the year. We call the Biden administration and the Congress to renew Caesar report. And that's so much work within the United States about the Caesar and the sanctions. And this is maybe the best pathway into Reem, who's been working on the missing persons during the ICMB, where now consider all the Caesar victims are missing. And at the same time, she's working now with the State Department, where the State Department in the United States became a vocal point for accountability and justice in Syria. Reem, if you can tell us more about that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Radwan, for having us. I definitely want to echo your sentiments that this is an interesting and potentially pivotal moment for Syria. Before jumping on this Zoom call, I was looking at all the photos and videos coming out of Hama, especially of the prisoner releases that are happening now out of Hama Central Prison. And so, needless to say, a lot of mixed emotions, lots of very, very happy emotions, lots of also fear as we enter a moment of unknown. As for the issue of accountability, currently I work with the Office of Global Criminal Justice, covering Syria. And I will say that since 2014 and the Security Council veto for an ICC referral, what we have seen is international resolve to find new and creative ways to pursue justice in the face of the deadlock at the Security Council. And so we've seen efforts by the US and others to really take advantage of the UN Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly, OPCW, and other mechanisms to really try to find ways to not only gather evidence, but also push for various mechanisms and efforts for accountability. We saw the establishment of the IIIM, which the US was very much behind, and we continue to support diplomatically through information sharing and through funding. We also are very much supportive of Syrian civil society, who have played an immense and pivotal role in all of this, in gathering and preserving and analyzing millions of pieces of evidence over the decade plus that the Syrian conflict has taken place. Within the US, we have seen the investigation and prosecution of a number of cases. The Beatles is probably the most notable, the four men who grew up in London and volunteered to fight for ISIS. They held 26 hostages in captivity. Two of those individuals were prosecuted in the US. In April 2022, the jury convicted one of the Beatles members for hostage taking that resulted in the death of 4 US citizens. A second Beatle was also pleaded guilty and is now sentenced to life imprisonment. Most recently, we saw the case brought against Samira Sheikh for immigration fraud. Time will tell whether that will be expanded to other charges as well. And as you probably all can recall, Samira Sheikh was the head of Adra prison from 2005 to 2010 and served as the governor of Deir ez-Zor starting 2011. We've also seen victims with a U.S. nexus who've brought cases under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which basically enables them to sue state sponsors of terrorism. One of the cases is ongoing. It was brought by Obaida Mzayik in 2021, and in which he alleges that he was detained and tortured at the Air Force Intelligence Branch in Mezzeh. The other has resolved. It was brought by Mary Colvin's family, and the U.S. District Court ruled that the Assad regime did in fact methodically plan and perpetrate her assassination, and awarded her family $300 million in compensatory and punitive damages. I will say, though, the largest efforts to bring accountability have been outside of the U.S., and it's been an incredible effort of European states to investigate and prosecute regime officials, members of ISIS, and other parties to the conflict under the principles of universal jurisdiction and domestic law. We are tracking about over 300 cases to date, and those have been the real engines of criminal accountability. We obviously all know about the Anwar Reslan case in Germany, which was the first conviction of a Syrian official for crimes against humanity. There have been other cases, including the one against Ala M, who has been charged with sexual violence, torture, and killing while serving as a doctor in military hospitals in Homs and Damascus. Of course, there's also the current ongoing case brought before the International Court of Justice by the Netherlands and Canada against the Syrian regime under the Convention of Torture. Last November, the ICJ was able to issue a decision on provisional measures, ordering Syria to take all measures necessary to prevent acts of torture and other cruel treatment. Canada and the Netherlands will be filing pleadings in February, basically meant to show how torture is ongoing since the decision on provisional measures. That said, I will be, the first to state that the international community must do more to help close the impunity gap. Unfortunately, the political situation makes it increasingly difficult to try to refer the situation to the ICC. There have been efforts to bring an Article 15 and Article 14 leading before the ICC, but those are ongoing. There hasn't been any ICC activity to date. But to this end, the U.S. recently and proudly joined a cross-regional working group to explore options for enhancing accountability for the use of chemical weapons, and those efforts are ongoing out of The Hague. And so with that, that was just a little bit of a snapshot of the accountability efforts to date, and the hope is we will be able to see more and broader accountability for Syria in the future. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Reem. That's the best way actually to pivot into Yasmin, which will talk more about the universal jurisdiction. But it also, since I need also to bring the perspective of victims regarding the Caesar report. Uh, there was a hot debate among the Syrians when the photos of Caesar victims publicly published online. Um, of course, some of the families, they need answer about the fate of their beloved one who's been missing for 10 years or more, and they need an answer. And maybe, unfortunately, they found the answer in one of the in one of the photos. And then also, if you can talk more about that and the issue of universal jurisdiction, the Syrian community in Europe, especially in Germany, Spain, and France, been active bringing these cases into justice. Yasmin, please.
Thank you, Dr. Dwan, and thank you to the Arab Center for hosting us. So yeah, like you mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of some of the main accountability achievements that have been propelled by Syrian civil society, partners, supporters, etc., and to appreciate the novelty of some of the legal innovations that have been brought forward by Syrian accountability efforts. So I'll start by giving an overview of 5 different mechanisms that were employed with respect to the Syrian context that have really broadened the international legal tools available, not just to Syrians, but also in conflict situations beyond Syria. And then I'll end with a discussion on some of the challenges and opportunities that still face us in the accountability realm. The first mechanism that I want to talk about is the IIIM, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria, which was established in 2016 by the UN General Assembly. That one, everyone will remember, was born out of the double veto of Russia and China in 2014. So back then in the Security Council, there was a draft resolution to refer the situation in Syria to the UN Security Council, vetoed by Russia and China. And so that effectively blocked the prospect of the Syrian case being heard at the ICC, as well as the prospects of the establishment of an international criminal tribunal by the UN Security Council. So the General Assembly did the next best thing, which was establishing the IIIM. The IIIM has a mandate to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence of international crimes committed in Syria and to prepare case files. So basically, the IIIM can amass and has amassed a huge amount of evidence pertaining to crimes committed in the Syrian context. It is preserving this evidence, and it has further conducted analysis. It can go as far as to prepare case files against specific perpetrators. It can prepare thematic reports on particular crimes that have been committed throughout the country. It can support cases that are being filed in other jurisdictions, whether they're national or international jurisdictions. And to date, it has assisted over 200 investigations. But the limitation with the IIIM is that it is not itself a prosecutorial body or a judicial body. It cannot issue judgments of individual criminal responsibility or of state responsibility. So it remains constrained in that it can build the case files, but it can't actually issue any verdicts on the individuals in question. Nevertheless, the IIIM is the first body of its kind ever to be established. So as we see from the Syrian conflict, and because of the obstacles facing Syrians in obtaining accountability, we see the emergence of new mechanisms that can promote accountability. And since 2016, when it was established, we've already seen 2 other bodies that have been modeled similarly. So we had the creation of UNITAD in 2017, which is the UN investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh. And in 2018, we saw the emergence of the IIM, an independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar. So already we see Syrian accountability initiatives being exported to other conflict situations and having repercussions far beyond. The second mechanism that I want to talk about, which is much newer, is the IIMP, the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, which was also established by the UN General Assembly last year in 2023. The mandate of this body is to determine the fate of missing persons in Syria and to support victims, survivors, and their families. This is also the first mechanism of its kind to be created, and it is still in the process of launching its substantial work. So we look forward to seeing its substantial work being launched next year. Up until now, it's been creating more policies, procedures, etc. Moving on to the third tool that I want to discuss, which is universal jurisdiction, which Reem already touched on. So universal jurisdiction denotes that there are some crimes like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity that are so bad that any state should be able to prosecute the commission of these crimes, even if the perpetrator is not a national of that state, the victim is not a national of that state, the crime didn't happen within that state, or there is no other nexus or link that links the crime to that state. So just because of the nature of the crime and being so horrible, any state should be able to prosecute its commission. Now, Syria did not witness the emergence of universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdictions existed far before the Syrian case, but the Syrian case certainly did revitalize the use of this legal tool. And many academics, experts were starting to make the argument that universal jurisdiction is no longer relevant, or something that is no longer applicable. And so the Syrian case really revitalized the use of this tool. And in fact, since 2015, the Syrian universal jurisdiction cases represent half of all universal jurisdiction cases worldwide. Universal jurisdiction cases have been pursued in Austria, France, Germany, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And so basically the use of this strategy in Syria has advanced this legal tool as a means of prosecuting international criminals, even if they evade justice through other means. Number four, legal tool number four, I want to talk briefly about the French arrest warrant, which was issued in November of last year. So a French court issued an arrest warrant for Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, as well as his brother Maher al-Assad and two other senior Syrian state officials for complicity in chemical weapons attacks in Syria. The French Court of Appeals upheld this arrest warrant in June of this year, and we're still waiting on the Supreme Court to make the final decision in this respect. As an international lawyer, I will tell you that this is a truly significant and groundbreaking development that I have to admit, me personally, I was not expecting, because the prevailing legal opinion under international law until this point was that sitting heads of state have absolute immunity from jurisdiction of domestic courts. So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, stated in its 2012 opinion in the arrest warrant case that sitting heads of state can face prosecution before an international court, such as the International Criminal Court or an International Criminal Tribunal, but they remain immune from prosecution by domestic courts. And the ICJ specifically said that heads of state are even immune, and I quote, if they are suspected of having committed war crimes or crimes against humanity. So the ICJ went as far as to say sitting heads of state have immunity even if they commit mass atrocity crimes. So the French arrest warrant really challenges this predominant legal opinion. We're still waiting on the final verdict of the French Supreme Court, but it will be very interesting to see what this verdict brings about. And again, the repercussions will not just be for Syria, but if this arrest warrant is upheld, it will be very interesting to see what other countries decide to do with this across other conflict situations. And it could create a deterrent effect for heads of state from engaging in such practices. And the last mechanism that I want to talk about, which Reem also touched on, is the exceptional, or the call for the Exceptional Chemical Weapons Tribunal. In November of last year, a group of Syrian civil society organizations issued a call for the establishment of an Exceptional Chemical Weapons Tribunal to prosecute the use of chemical weapons. A few months later, in June of this year, a working group of 12 states from across North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa formed a working group, and it's a mouthful. It's called Working Group to Advance Proposals for International Criminal Accountability for Chemical Weapons Use. So they established this working group to explore options that exist around establishing a special mechanism to prosecute chemical weapons use. But what I should say and what I should note here is that while the Syrian civil society proposed an exceptional chemical weapons tribunal, this isn't necessarily what the working group is going to come up with. So they are exploring proposals, plural, and we'll see what they will come up with, if anything, whether it's a tribunal, whether it's something else. But it's still significant to see, again, the work and the advocacy of Syrian civil society with partners and supporters to push the legal boundaries and to push the readings of international law to create new mechanisms. So with this brief explanation of the various mechanisms, I wanted to end with a discussion on challenges and opportunities. The challenges we've already mentioned, in that these are all very innovative, groundbreaking mechanisms. They are a testament to the resilience of the Syrian people, despite the number of obstacles that the Syrian people have faced with the international system. They have persevered and they've really pushed the boundaries of what can be done. And the repercussions can be felt not only in Syria, but these very same tools and very same legal arguments can be used well beyond Syria. Now, coming to the challenges, the main challenge that I need to mention is jurisdictional constraints. Despite the groundbreaking nature of all of these mechanisms that I mentioned, the reality, unfortunately, is still that the vast majority of perpetrators who remain inside Syria remain outside the jurisdiction of these various courts, mechanisms, procedures, etc., because all of them require physical custody at the very least. So we can have trials in absentia, which is what the French arrest warrant was about. It issued an arrest warrant for President Assad in absentia. We saw the prosecutions of Ali Mamlouk and others in absentia in France as well. But without their physical presence in the country that is enforcing this arrest warrant, or without their visitation to another country that's willing to extradite them to France, for example, then the chances of enforcing this arrest warrant are slim. And the last thing that I want to mention in terms of challenge is something that was also touched on earlier, which is we have to contextualize these advancements and these victories within the wider international failure on Syria. So the international community failed Syria, number one, in failing to protect Syrian civilians. If we had seen concerted, timely effort by the international community to protect Syrian civilians, we wouldn't have seen this number of mass atrocities being committed, and we wouldn't have need to pursue these accountability initiatives. And then the second failure is the failure of the international criminal institutions themselves. With the system not working the way it's supposed to, Syria not being able to have access to the International Criminal Court or an International Criminal Tribunal. So while the Syrian part of it represents a success, we have to remember that it is tainted by a wider international failure, and we need to hold the international community accountable for why it let the situation spiral into the way it is today. And I'll end on that note. Thank you so much.
No, excellent. Thank you very much, Yasmin. That's very interesting because you touch on very creative ways to bring accountability, especially IIIM and the International Commission of the Missing Persons. But as you said exactly, that's exactly putting the office of the prosecutor before we have a prosecutor itself. Because it has no jurisdiction, legislative or jurisdiction over Syria. And now with that, I need to ask David a question. With the current event in Syria and the political change of the map of the forces on the ground, and we don't know yet if the opposition will be able to advance into into Damascus to build a regime. This is still we don't know because there is too much international actors in Syria. The US has troops, Russia has troops, Turkey, Iran, and too many countries involved in Syria, and this is why you cannot actually, let's say, even imagine what the scenarios will be because you don't know exactly which actor will how they will behave in the future. But with the question of the accountability, and back in 2012 everyone talking about the special tribunal, uh, special international tribunal on Syria. As the case, we have through two models. Uh, One of them has to be established through the Security Council resolution, like the one you work on, like Sierra Leone. Uh, but then we will most likely will have Russian and Chinese veto, most likely. And the other pathway actually to go through the General Assembly through the Cambodian model, which is special tribunals, special chamber for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But that's long way and it's need of the approval of the General Assembly and is not that attractive because of the cost of the court. But still, the universal jurisdiction cannot satisfy the question of justice because it's very cherry picky. As Yasmin mentioned, most of the cases absentia, like the case in France, and those very low level. When we talk about the big fish, we have to address the case on the international level. What do you think, David?
Well, one is I deeply appreciate the comments of my fellow panelists, and I found them very, very important in the overall discussion, and I thank them for that. You know, the bright red thread of atrocity accountability is politics. It's a political decision to create justice mechanisms. It was a political decision to create, you know, the original four major tribunals: Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Cambodia, as well as Yugoslavia. And it'll be a political decision or not what to do about Syria and even Ukraine. I've been working very, very hard for the past 2.5 years to develop an accountability mechanism for aggression. That's a side point. But the point is I, at this point, and I have to be quite frank with you, I don't see a political interest at the international level and frankly at the regional level to hold Assad accountable for what has taken place. But, you know, as things move quickly in Syria and as this opposition army gains momentum, the world is fickle. It could be changed. But again, we also have, as you correctly state, other actors within Syria. It's not just black and white. It's not, you know, the opposition army and the Syrian army. It is a whole bunch of various actors with all kinds of various political perspectives related to an outcome for Syria, one way or the other, not just accountability, but just a political outcome related to Syria. The Russians are very much involved. The U.S. has a piece of this, but there are many others, and to include the Emirates all along the Gulf, they all are in the background manipulating outcomes. And with all of that dust in the air, it's uncertain in certainly the short and the medium term that any accountability will be had. But again, I want to underscore that accountability can come. When I took down the first sitting head of state for war crimes and crimes against humanity, President Charles Taylor, back in 2003, it took us another 3 years, but he was handed over to us for a fair and open trial. So these things happen. You have to keep moving forward. In the business that we are all in, I like to say it's sometimes 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but I always like to tell those who are working with me, as long as we're leaning forward, we'll continue to move forward. So again, to honestly tell you, I see no a positive outcome for atrocity accountability in the short term at the level that you're mentioning, dealing with some type of international justice mechanism. But again, that should not deter us with the universal jurisdiction efforts, other efforts going on, the IIIM, which I have an interesting anecdote. I remember going to see a couple of ambassadors. We had kind of a semi-official working group for Syria, and I had just given them a draft outline of a indictment of President Assad, and we were sitting around the table and during this time frame in 2016, and I was becoming increasingly frustrated because, again, Syria had left the front page after the Caesar report after 2 years. Nobody was talking about Syria, but yet we had numerous NGOs working in and around Syria, stepping all over the evidence and kind of getting in the way. And I was concerned that we were losing the capacity to somehow grab all of this evidence in a way that we could preserve it and turn it into, as I mentioned, into something that we could actually go into court, like the Caesar photographs. So I casually mentioned to him, what about a Syrian Accountability Center where we have a centralized professional group of taking all the data that all of these numerous NGOs and semi-official organization had out there, take it, sift through it, and do something about it. And so over time, it ended up being the IIIM for Syria, which is a important alternative to justice. It's not justice, but it's an important alternative. At least it was a step in the right direction, and we will see that mechanisms like COIs and commissions from the Human Rights Council will still be kind of the default position to give politically the world a sense that we are, quote, doing something as opposed to doing nothing. But at the end of the day, it'll be accountability has to be done through an appropriate court or tribunal with the appropriate jurisdiction. But in a long-winded way, I don't see us moving in a direction that I think we would all like to see at this point, not in the short term or medium term, but not to lose hope. Things happen, and they're happening right now as we speak in Homs and elsewhere as things develop. But again, it will be a political decision by the international community, not a legal one.
Thank you, David. I think you raised very important question about the role of the civil society. Because what happened after things in Syria got lowered into less attention of the international arena, the Syrian civil society stay active, not only on the regional, but also on the international level. And we have to remember that IIIM and other mechanism of the missing persons, it's actually the outcome of a long process of cooperation between the civil society organizations. And I think that's important. It can also now trigger a mechanism on the injustice on the international level if the Syrian civil society continue to work after what's going now and bring it back into the state, Syria back into the stage. Yasmin, you want to say something about that, please?
Sorry, the microphone. I completely agree with what you said about Syrian civil society, and I think that was central to the mechanisms that I was mentioning and showing how Syrians were at the forefront of pushing, because there were so many obstacles to accountability, but that drive and need for accountability nevertheless drove Syrians to push for these mechanisms at the national and the international levels. And I also agree with David that an overarching criminal court or special tribunal, or something that we would ideally aspire to is difficult or out of reach at the moment. I do agree with that, and I wanted to mention one alternative when it comes to the Special Chemical Weapons Tribunal. One proposal that Syrian civil society put forward with regards to the special tribunal is that states can create a new system or a new body based on the principle of pooled universal jurisdiction of states. So the idea is that we can create multilateral accountability mechanisms that involve multiple states, but this would be on a treaty basis. So we create a body. This is based on a treaty that states can sign. And by signing this treaty, they are delegating their right to practice universal jurisdiction. For example, there are different ways that it can be done. But still, what we're constrained here is that we are relying on the states that would willingly sign such a treaty. As it stands, the UN Security Council is the only body that can issue binding and enforceable measures on all UN member states, which is why only the Security Council can create a binding, enforceable accountability initiative. The General Assembly, in turn, created the IIIM, which states can be part of, can support, but it is not binding. Its decisions are not binding on states. So I just also wanted to mention that distinction.
Thank you, Yasmin. Reem, David mentioned very important point, which the lack of the political appetite for justice and accountability in Syria, especially in the last 10 years. Of course, we have example of such international court like the Special Court of Lebanon, where after the court, I think the budget of the court exceeded $3 billion, and they indicted 4 Lebanese for the killing of the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, and none of them actually show up, or the state of Lebanon itself did not cooperate actually to deliver those. And then when news coming out from Syria, that's 3 of them at least killed in the fighting in Syria when the Hezbollah militias involved in the fighting and supporting, backing the Syria regime. That's always an example comes up when we talk about the special international court for Syria. A high budget, a very low outcome. What do you think that's the best model to Syria then?
I mean, I think that that's the million-dollar question. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon is exactly one of the concerns that I know that many in the political space look at when thinking about a special tribunal for Syria, particularly given the jurisdictional limitations that Yasmin highlighted, the fact that many of these individuals are out of reach, and a lot of this stuff will be done in absentia. That said, I think that there is still space to try to figure out how best to seek accountability for Syria, given the real, very pragmatic realities of the limitations of international justice, which are many, from political to jurisdictional to other realities. I will say, it's interesting. I recently sat in a meeting with civil society from Afghanistan, who are currently having their situation investigated by the ICC. And what they asked of our office was, how can they get more universal jurisdiction cases? And they were particularly interested in meeting with individuals working on Syria, because we have been able to use universal jurisdiction far more than most other conflicts. So it's always a question of what is what is going to be the mechanism that is able to produce and achieve accountability the most and the quickest. And I think that those are very, very difficult questions. But that's not to say that that what we have in Syria now is sufficient. It's absolutely not sufficient. And I agree with everyone. And I'm the first to say that there's always a desire, and I say this in both my professional but also my personal capacity, to try to push for additional accountability efforts and mechanisms to try to seek justice and accountability for the horrendous crimes that have taken place in Syria. And with that, I will say that, Syrian civil society has played an incredible role in pushing the international community for more and creative ways to seek accountability. And but for Syrian civil society, I don't think that we would have seen what we have seen thus far, from the creation of the IIIM, to the recent ICJ case, to all the universal jurisdiction cases that we're seeing in Europe and elsewhere, to this establishment of a working group that is trying to look at, criminal accountability options for the use of chemical weapons. And so, in many ways, Syrian civil society has been the element that has really pushed the international community, and I hope that they continue to play this very pivotal role. Both, again, I say this both in my professional but also in my personal capacity.
Thank you, Reem. Back to you, David, because there is an important question right now related to the current event. Of course, there is a scenario that maybe the opposition will not be able to control most of the territories because the Syrian regime, they still have the backing of Iran and Russia, and those very, very involved very heavily in the bombarding on the cities like Hama and Aleppo and in Idlib. I mean, it's continuous as it was in 2014 and 15, where the Syrian regime freely can drop the barrel bombs, and we know every drop of barrel bombs is a crimes against a war crime, because it does not respect any of the conditions of the international humanitarian law regarding precaution, distinguish, and proportionality. And this is why I think when the first statement came 2 days ago from the United States, Germany, and the UK and France asked for protection of the civilians. What the model and scenarios now for the international community to be able to protect the civilians? Putting in mind, as Yasmin said, that the international community abandoned Syria for a long time. We're talking about estimate 800,000 lost their lives and 7 million refugees and displaced in the country, where the international community was unable to protect or to release what political prisoners from any of the prisons who killed during Caesar. And Caesar stopped photographing because he get back out of Syria in 2014. Now, 10 years later, we can imagine how many Caesar victims still going on in the Syrian detention centers. David?
One of the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law is protecting civilians. And under the laws of armed conflict, civilians cannot be intentionally targeted. But in these, as I call them, these dirty little wars of the 21st century, civilians, particularly women and children, pay a particularly brutal price in these conflicts. And we're seeing it playing out. We saw it played out in Syria. I saw it played out in West Africa, et cetera. But we also see it played out in Gaza. We see it played out in Lebanon. We see it play out in Ukraine, where one or both parties ignore the laws of armed conflict, ignore the protections of civilians, civilian property, civilian objects, and destroy. So that this is a trend, and it's a troubling trend related to ignoring the rule of law on the battlefield, which we do have, centuries-old concepts which we try to, in fact, limit the destruction of conflict and protect prisoners of war, civilians, the wounded and sick. We're seeing this play out in the 21st century, where we have belligerents ignoring this and seeing horrific ends to that. And of course, Syria was a good example of what I call a kaleidoscopic conflict. And we're still in a kaleidoscopic conflict, where one thing changes, everything changes. It just one shift, and all of a sudden, a logical thought process that you would be thinking about politically, legally, socially, morally, culturally, as to where this might play out, all of a sudden, one thing shifts and everything goes the other way. And we saw this in Syria. We're seeing it continuing in Syria. And so it causes difficulties related to trying to come up with a logical end state for Syria in a way that is stable and restores international peace and security in the Levant region, which is again very, very. This is as troubled as I've seen it in my many years through the Cold War and into the 21st century, where we have dangerous situations that could cause conflict and potentially world conflict very, very quickly because of all of the players, both stemming from Gaza, Lebanon, and as well as now Syria again starting to bubble over. And this could bring in a whole bunch of parties that reluctantly don't want to be a part of it, but have to for various political reasons. But again, the underscoring that I want to make is that you cannot target civilians, yet we're targeting civilians to the level of tens of thousands of human beings being destroyed. And we have to be mindful of that and really hold to the standard that we can't intentionally target civilians or civilian objects. I've just developed a working group with potentially looking at a new crime against humanity called mass destruction, where it is the policy of a belligerent who knows that they cannot win the conflict, choose to go ahead and destroy the territory of the other belligerent just because they can't win, but they do not want the other side to win as well. And so in the jurisprudential aspect of this, in crimes against humanity, you always have in the statute, creative statute, or in the Rome statute, you always have at the end of the other inhumane or the crimes against humanity portion of the statute that lists all the crimes, you always have the paragraph that says, and other inhumane acts. And we use this particularly when we created a new crime against humanity called forced marriage in times of armed conflict that we saw in West Africa to capture the horror of the bushwives. And so what we're looking at now is that, again, calling for the world to recognize as an other inhumane act within a crime against humanity the concept of mass destruction, which captures the gravamen of what I think you're intuitively asking me, and that is you can't win, but we're not going to let them win either. And so we're just going to destroy wantonly whole sections of a belligerent's territory for just the sole purpose of destroying it. And so we're working on that, and then we'll be rolling that out at the beginning of 2025. And that is the mass destruction, which we see in Gaza, we see in Ukraine, for example. And frankly, we saw when the conflict was really cooking off in 2011, even though we've had other challenges all the way back to the 1980s, where we have a government just destroying things because they can. The barrel bombs is a good example in Syria of what I would call a mass destruction type of offense. We can't win, we can't lose, but we're just going to kill them and destroy things. And that's not covered by other crimes against humanity. And so that's what we're thinking of.
That's very, very interesting. We'll see how this will develop. But that's actually move us into other question, or to be asked me from your previous work on R2B, responsibility to protect. We've seen the first international, of course, tribunal was in Yugoslavia in 1996, and it established on the premise that it should be never again. And it was a big hope for the international community and everyone working on the issue of justice and accountability. That's a new wave of international justice is coming. And we see that into different international court established in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, in Cambodia for crimes happened 30 years before. And then what's happened in Syria in 2011, it's puzzled everyone on the question of the international justice mechanism and R2B. We saw different initiatives, the Brazilian initiative about responsibility while protecting, other initiatives actually preventing the international community of the misuse of the R2B. And there was a big resistance of the use of R2B, of like a manifesto for the NATO and the United States to intervene in other countries, like what happened in Libya. But after in Syria, we saw things in Ukraine where no one can bring the issue of justice in Ukraine and accountability because Russia is permanent member at the Security Council. And then we saw the issue in Gaza, where yesterday the Amnesty International accused the Israeli of committing genocide in Gaza. We don't know how the international community responds to the ICC arrest warrant. Do we are entering a new era of international law that's failed the people in Syria and Ukraine and the Palestinians in Gaza, and what the scenarios will be then if with the new political change here in the United States and in the right wing in Europe who target actually the international institutions to be the target. What the implication of that for the international law?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. So I'm gonna almost contradict myself, and I'm gonna say that my personal belief is that international law is moving towards in the direction of greater protections. So when we talk about law, when we talk about legal precedents, when we talk about court judgments, the law seems to be moving in the direction of not accepting impunity for mass atrocity crimes. So we've seen, I touched on the French arrest warrant, for example. Reem touched on the ICJ case that was brought forward by Canada and the Netherlands. Now, Canada and the Netherlands are two countries that are not directly affected by Syria's commission of torture. So they're not filing this case as injured parties. But nevertheless, the ICJ has come to recognize through through former case laws in the past years that there are some crimes that the state doesn't have to be directly affected. What we're talking about, violations of the Convention Against Torture, for example, which affects the international community as a whole. And for this reason, any state can bring a case within the ICJ against any other state and member of the Convention Against Torture for the violation of this convention. So we actually see international law moving in a direction of more protection, less tolerance for the commission of mass atrocity crimes. But I also think it goes back to something that David mentioned earlier, when David, you mentioned that accountability is politicized, and maybe we can even broaden that sentiment and say that international law in general is politicized. So we would still maintain that what Syria has done, the Syrian government has done against its people, contravenes international law. We can make the argument that the international community, in particular states' responses, violate their obligations to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. We can argue that the United States, through its complicity in genocide in Gaza, is violating its Article 1 Genocide Convention to prevent genocide, as well as its Article 1 of the Geneva Convention's responsibility to ensure respect for these conventions. So the law, and there are cases. There's a case before the ICJ at the moment to look at the ongoing genocide in Gaza as well. So from a legal standpoint, I don't think that the legal system is weakening, but the implementation, as always, unfortunately, is very politicized. And so R2P, just a few more thoughts on R2P. R2P itself is not a legally binding norm. So R2P was introduced in 2001 as a concept. It was unanimously upheld or endorsed in 2005 by the UN General Assembly. And it's been broken down since then in 2009 in a report by the UN Secretary General into 3 pillars. The first is the responsibility of each state to protect its own people from mass atrocity crimes. This is deeply entrenched in international law. We have the obligation not to commit genocide, the obligation not to commit war crimes, the obligation not to commit crimes against humanity. These 3 are Jus Cogens norms, meaning that there can be no derogation from them under international law. This is very solid. The second pillar is usually where there's more controversy. The second pillar of R2P says that if a state fails to protect its own people, then the international community should have a responsibility to respond and react and make sure that these people are protected. And states traditionally are very hesitant to assume an obligation to have to protect civilians in a conflict situation that has nothing to do with them. So states are very hesitant to accept that responsibility and to take it on. But nevertheless, even then, there are certain international legal norms that actually impart these kinds of obligations on states. So we have Article 1 of the Genocide Convention says that all states have a duty to prevent genocide. And in the International Court of Justice Bosnia case in 2005, the court maintained and expanded and defined this as every state must take all measures or use all measures at its disposal to prevent genocide, even if that genocide is not happening within its borders or even if it does not have a link. Same thing with the common Article 1 obligation to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. It's been upheld through the construction of a wall case by the ICJ, numerous General Assembly resolutions, mostly pertaining to Palestine, that this obligation means that all state parties to the Geneva Convention have an obligation to ensure respect for this convention by all parties, even if this is not a conflict they're involved in. So there are norms that exist, and again, I think international law is moving in this direction, but unfortunately, the stronger parties are able to get away with what they can because they are the stronger party.
Thank you, Yasmin. For Reem, the International COI, Commission of Inquiry on Syria, they issued a statement yesterday cautioning about the protection of the civilians. But it also mentions, because what they've seen in there, the dynamics of the Syrian war, that there is a policy of revenge. Especially, there is a high expectation of the use of the chemical weapons by the Syrian regime against the civilians. We saw yesterday, as example, when he bombarding 4 hospitals in Idlib and 2 hospitals in Aleppo. That's the main hospital in Aleppo. And we saw the manager or the director of the hospital speaking out against this. If things actually unfold and the Syrian regime continue to use the chemical weapons, especially the Syrian regime still control the sky, the opposition has no way. They capture some of the airplanes there and there, but none of them will be able to fly with. It's a very outdated airplanes, and they don't have the capacity and the capability to do that. If the Syrian regime use on a mass level again the chemical weapons, do you think that will change again the international scene or the reaction of the international community at that level?
I mean, I feel like that's a very difficult question for me to answer. The reality is that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons repeatedly throughout this conflict. And that's been verified not just by the US, but by OPCW and others. The hope is that more can be done. And that is exactly why, for us, the United States and our office specifically pushed to join this working group to try to determine ways to push for criminal accountability around the use of chemical weapons. Not just in Syria, there has been chemical weapons used in Ukraine. There's been reports in Myanmar and other places as well. And so the reality is that, the use of chemical weapons is unfortunately in recent years on the rise. That said, I think that there is a real fear of the continued and expanded use of chemical weapons given recent events. That is something that we are closely monitoring. Our colleagues that work on chemical weapons are also closely monitoring and continued talks on and around. how to deal with it is a difficult question, and it's a question that I know many in the international community have tried to think about for years now. There has been many on the record and off the record conversations about how to deal with accountability around the use of chemical weapons, particularly given many of the jurisdictional limitations. I think beyond that, it would be very hard for me to speculate what exactly would be a response. I can only hope that there would be a strong response from the international community if there is continued use of chemical weapons. And my greater hope is that there won't be continued use of chemical weapons. Part of the fear of what is happening now, while there are very positive images of detainees being released, is that there is the reprisal of the regime, the fear that Russia and Iran will continue to engage in the warfare that they have engaged for many years, whether it's the use of barrel bombs or the targeting and indiscriminate targeting of civilian locations, hospitals and towns and cities. And we have begun to see that in Idlib and Aleppo now. So I hope that there will be a response, but I can't tell you now what that response would be and what it would look like, especially so many years into this conflict. But yeah, I guess that's all I can say at this moment.
Thank you, Reem. Maybe final question to David, then Yasmin's about your hope of the accountability in Syria. I mean, at the beginning of the Syrian uprising, 2011, 2012, you see every Syrian citizen turned into working as documenting what's going on, because there is a hope that something will come out of it, something justice and accountability. But that hope fall again in 2014, 15, and continue to fall down with the abandonment of the international community of the Syrian people. That's very important because that will reflect how Syrians, and in any community or any society, will go through what the Syrian people went through, into how justice is important for the future. That's a pillar of reconstruction Syrian state in the future, based on justice, rule of law, and accountability. But if there is the spread of the culture of the impunity, it continue as we've seen in the past and continue in the future, that's maybe a pillar of destruction of the whole Syrian society, not the state itself. I would like actually to hear your final comments on this question, David and Yasmin. David?
Well, just thank you, and I appreciate that. And I'll briefly just mention, we're in the age, what I call the age of the strongman. We've kind of moved away from an international approach to solving international peace and security, and moved into a more regional and nationalistic outlook as far as dealing with challenges that we see. And I think that this is very, very troublesome. My hope is we have an ability to continue to move forward, and that democracies around the world stand firm in seeking justice for victims of atrocity, because that's the only correct path. But in this age of strongman, and as the United States begins to slip into that category of strongman, it augurs poorly for the, as I've already said, the short-term and medium-term outlook as to the world coming together to do this. The days of there are three phases of atrocity accountability. First phase was in Nuremberg, where the world kind of experimented with the idea of atrocity accountability. We have the age of accountability starting in 1993 to around 2015, where the world was actually taking on and dealing with heads of state and others who fed on their own citizens. And now we have uniquely, and some of this was caused by Syrians fleeing their country and spilling over into Europe, and causing various politicians to politically hang on to and use as a theme people coming in from outside and using it and calling on kind of a nationalistic approach to keeping a particular country safe from outsiders coming in. And so this spills over into this more nationalistic approach to dealing with domestic issues as opposed to the countries coming together and united under the United Nations paradigm. And so, I, at this point in time, I hope that we could get through this, and perhaps 5 years from now, when we're chatting, we could talk about this. But we're in some very difficult times, and a hurricane of lawlessness is on the horizon, of which we do not know where this is going. It's a negative final thought, but we have to deal with the world as it is and not as we would like it to be.
Thank you, David. Yasmin, the final word.
Thanks. I'm just going to be very general. What I hope to see is, number one, civilian protection. Even in the context of accountability, I think civilian protection is paramount, because without it, we just have the continued commission of more atrocities. Number two is, I hope that every victim of a crime finds the justice that they want to see and receives the justice that they want to see. And number three is that every perpetrator of a crime is held to account. I don't know how we will achieve this. I don't know through what mechanisms, but this is our hope. And this is what we're going to aspire to. And we're going to try to achieve as much of it as we can.
Thank you for Yasmin for the positive note, and thank you, David, for the negative note. Thank you, Reem, for your participation. It was very an important and likely event. I thank everyone who's been listening to our webinar, and you can see the recorded one at our website at the arabwashingtondc.org. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.